Hi there, my name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Brendan Marks. Brendan is the UNC Tar Heels and Duke Blue Devils college basketball reporter at The Athletic. In this episode, I chat with Brendan about his early days in sports media, writing about the Tar Heels for the Student University newspaper, his early beats, the experiences working at the Charlotte Observer and Sports Illustrated, his transition to digital media, some of his features at The Athletic, and his advice for young journalists. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. Now let's get to episode 46 with Brendan Marks on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Brendan Marks. He is a college basketball reporter for The Athletic, covering Duke and the University of North Carolina Tar Heels. Brendan, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it, Lucas. Hope all is well with you.
Well, it is, and it's much better when we're talking about probably the best rivalry in college basketball in Duke and North Carolina. And Brendan, I got to ask you because, look, I mean, reporters sometimes, you take one team. Not only are you taking two of the biggest programs in the country, but you're taking, the two biggest, bitterest rivals. So what's that like as a reporter to get constant hate mail from, both teams?
Yeah, it's super easy. Never any accusations of me being a favorite for one fan base or the other. I think there was a day it was a couple of months ago. It was before sports sort of shut down, but I was called a UNC homer, a Duke homer, and an NC State homer all on the same day. So I like to think that means that I'm doing my job and not showing any favoritism. But certainly it is a unique market where I live in Durham, North Carolina, having UNC and Chapel Hill 8 miles apart. It's so interesting because while you mentioned that the two schools are such bitter rivals, it actually works out really well for me because I'm able to sort of balance the schools against one another. So, for example, early on in the season, we can draw these hyperbolic conclusions about teams, but once we get into the season, I can say, okay, well, I'm seeing this from one school. I'm not seeing this from the other. So I sort of use it as a way to sort of measure just exactly what I'm seeing, not to fall into any traps myself. And also, it's just a lot of fun. I mean, there's a lot of really different characteristics and qualities to each fan base, to each market, to each school. So, yeah, I mean, I like to think that I have the best job in the world. For my money, the best rivalry in college sports, one of the best in sports in general, I would say. So certainly it is a blessing to be able to cover both teams.
Well, up in Canada, where I am being based in Toronto, I mean, we're used to, the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Montreal Canadiens in hockey being the big rivalry. But, Brendan, I mean, on those two nights at the Dean Smith Center and then at the Cameron Indoor Stadium, I mean, as a reporter, I mean, what is that experience like? And maybe just compare and contrast, like you said, I mean, the different characteristics of, the big game for those two fan bases.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that, so for me, I'm actually a graduate of North Carolina, full disclaimer, which makes for sort of an interesting thorn in this whole conversation. Personally, I don't think you can beat the atmosphere at Cameron Indoor Stadium. When you go there, it is so small, it is so intimate, it is so cramped that media, we are literally sitting in the front row along the sideline. And so when the ball goes out of bounds, you have to watch to make sure it doesn't hit your laptop. Fans come over when someone's throwing the ball in from out of bounds. They're putting their hands on you. They're touching you. They're actively pressing up against you. So that obviously creates this fervent, electric atmosphere in Cameron Indoor that really can't be replicated, I think, in a lot of other sports venues just because of the infrastructural constraints of the building. Whereas at the Dean Dome, it's much more booming, has a much larger capacity, much more, as Duke fans would like to say, of a wine and cheese crowd than you would find over at Cameron Indoor. But I think the two schools just have very different sort of stereotypes about them, and to some extent they're true and to some extent they're not. At Duke, obviously is a smaller private institution. North Carolina is a large public state school. So you find different types of people going to the different schools. majority of people going to North Carolina are from North Carolina. The majority of the people going to Duke, if they're not from North Carolina, are from New York. They're from New Jersey. They're from California. They're from Florida. So it's different than an entire population base that does grow up sort of watching the rivalry. But certainly as soon as people get on campus, they very quickly learn what side of the blue they're supposed to be wearing.
No, for sure. And you in one of the games this year was, one of the best college basketball games of the season. I mean, when you have, UNC up 13 and then Duke comes back and then the Trey Jones buzzer beater. I'm just curious for you, as a reporter and your process writing, a game like that. I mean, Duke UNC, enough said is a big game. But as a reporter, like, do you feel like, when you're trying to capture a moment of, like, let's say a buzzer beater, like like your words matter even more just given the nature and the history of this rivalry?
I think so. There's definitely a sense of that. For me, whenever those two teams play, it's really the best of both worlds for me. It's the best possible situation because, one, it means that I'm not missing something else. I'm not missing one of my two teams, but also it means that the entire basketball world and in the media, fans, coaches, other players and teams, everyone is trained on that one game. So the enormity of the moment. So you do know that you have to sort of factor in the historic element of that when you're writing. So, this year, those buzzer beaters, in North Carolina and Duke history, there are the Austin Rivers buzzer beater. There's the Marvin Williams putback. There are these famous moments, and seeing that live and in person, you realize, okay, maybe not now, but in 10 or 15 years, people are going to talk about this the way they are currently talking about those other shots. So you do have to contextualize it sort of within the historical importance of the rivalry. But for me, I love it because regardless of who wins, I know I get a great story. It's an unbelievable story regardless. And, my former peers at North Carolina like to kid with me, don't you root for UNC in those games? Not at all. I root for the best story. Yeah. So when Trey Jones hits one of those buzzer beaters, that is as great a possible outcome for me because not only is it incredible just story, but the emotion that's going to come with it, the emotions that it's going to elicit, all of that is unmatched in any other game that you see all year. It's my favorite night of the year every year. And especially there are some years when we get a third matchup in the ACC championship. I mean, that's the best that you can hope for as a sports reporter.
And then, I mean, I haven't, but then of course, perhaps the March Madness, right? Like that would, take the cherry on the cake, like, Final Four, Duke, UNC, like that would be just insane.
It's something that is often discussed here, but I'm not so sure that the fans of either school actually know what they'd be signing up for that because think about it. If Duke and UNC ever were to meet in the national championship game, the argument's over. The rivalry's over. Whoever wins that game has the bragging rights forever until it happens again, at least. So, we love the rivalry so much that I think that's one of the few things that could sort of swing it in this crazy imbalance. But I mean, there's nothing else like the emotion that comes with it, the hatred. It is truly the biggest night of my calendar year in terms of coverage. And I think it's that way for a lot of people who feel that way as fans too.
Shifting gears, Brendan, and talking about your career, obviously, you mentioned you're a proud Tar Heel alum and, attending University of North Carolina. Did you always want to go into sports journalism and the sports media industry?
It was something that definitely was put on my radar, I think, a little later than some others. There are people who grew up reading the newspaper every Sunday with their parents. That wasn't necessarily me. I'd look at the comics. But over time, I learned how much I love sports, and I always had that love from the time I was a little kid. And I realized that, okay, as a 5'9", unathletic, the guy that I am, I realized that I was not going to make a career playing sports. And sports journalism to me has come to be as rewarding and fulfilling because you get to be as close to the emotion and the competitiveness and the characters as you do in anything else. So I probably first realized that this was something I really wanted to do once I got to UNC and I saw that there were people who were much better than me. much better writers, better reporters, better everything. And you really challenge yourself then, and you go, okay, if these people are doing this, what can I turn it into? How can I make it my own? And I think when you start to see how you can individualize it and personalize it, that's when I really decided, okay, this is for me. Now it's just about finding my niche in the greater conversation.
And, speaking of finding that niche, I mean, you, of course, were writing at, the Daily Tar Heel, and, we're able to cover, UNC sports, from, as an undergrad. And I'm just curious, I mean, that experience, just getting those reps must have been so crucial for you to be able to develop and hone your craft.
Yeah, working at the student newspaper in college, the Daily Tar Heel at UNC, was the best thing that I ever could have done in my career. I mean, the things that you learn in doing student publications, I think, are oftentimes things that you don't learn in classes. I learned how to write on deadline. I learned what a deadline was. I learned what the pressure of a deadline feels like. And those are things that professors can tell you about, or your peers can tell you about, or your favorite columnist from the paper that your hometown had. People can tell you that, but until you actually experience it, it's totally different. It's just like in football, like you mentioned, you have to get the reps to do it. So first you go from turning a game story in the course of a weekend to turning a game story in the course of 5 hours, 3 hours, 2 hours. And then eventually over time, you learn how to have a game story ready as soon as the buzzer sounds. So, it definitely was as productive a staff as I could have been on. Like I said, learning from people who are still very well connected in the industry, people who I have seen go on and do great things. The people on my college newspaper staff worked at ESPN, the Washington Post. They're my colleagues at the Athletics. So getting that sort of in-person experience, but also the exposure to people of that caliber at an early age, it was essential in me ever getting to the point that I have, and especially getting here as quickly as I have.
And it also helps to cover UNC basketball back-to-back national championship appearances too.
That certainly does help. That's obviously the fun part, but at the same time, I would point to some of the not as fun parts.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a sophomore at UNC, Dean Smith died. I'll never remember that. I'll never forget that day. I mean, I remember so vividly waking up on my couch and reading the text from my sports editor at the time saying, Dean died, get to the office and bring stuff, because you're going to be here for a while. So that day was the single most, impressive day of collaborative journalism that I've ever seen. The way that so many different people on staff were able to pool their resources to develop this visually stunning product, but also just to commemorate the occasion. And those are the sorts of real world experiences that you have to sort of learn on the fly for. One of my former mentors told me, you're never fully prepared for a job that you apply for until you actually are in the position.
Mm-hmm.
And that's if you're covering general assignments, if you're covering high school, if you're covering colleges, you're covering pros, you're never fully ready until you're actually there. And there is always going to be some element of learning on the fly. And so for me, getting to get some of those mistakes out of the way earlier on big occasions and big stories, it's something you can't replicate. It's something that I wish every student journalist and up-and-comer could have the opportunity to do.
And, look, I speak with, young journalists all the time, and I've had, sports media members on the show, and who, and look, people are always said, young journalists, look, the industry's, restricting, and there's not a lot of jobs in the industry. And while, look, the industry is shrinking and it's, tough. I mean, if you have that work ethic and passion and have those experiences, the chances are great for you, to get it and make it in the industry. And you're a perfect example of that, where, you work at the Daily Tar Heel, you then get an internship at Sports Illustrated, which then, leads to an opportunity at the Charlotte Observer. So I'm just, curious about those real world experiences at SI, at the Charlotte Observer, that just, showed you, the ropes of covering sports and sports teams.
Absolutely. I'm incredibly lucky to be where I am. There are a lot of people who are just as talented, if not more talented than me, who work harder, if not as hard as me. there are so many people, and to some extent it is about getting lucky and things working out in your favor. So I feel very fortunate to even be where I am. But yeah, certainly. I mean, interning at Sports Illustrated, I mean, what an experience. And obviously Sports Illustrated has undergone a lot of changes since I was even an intern there a couple of years ago. But I think that was the first time that I really learned the rigors of an editing process. I think a lot of young journalists, we are very happy when we have worked on this story. We've reported it for several weeks. We've been building and growing, and finally here it is, our baby. We're ready to present it to our editors, and they come back with a red pen. And
the
right.
feeling.
And you see, you're like, this is my baby, and it's slashed, it's slaughtered. What have you done? But the fact is that they are doing that for a reason. They're not doing it to make you upset. They're not doing it to make you angry. They're doing it to make you better. And so I before I interned at Sports Illustrated, I wrote a freelance feature for them the November of my senior year of college. I submitted a 6-page draft. I got back 5 pages of red notes on a 6-page draft. It was basically as many notes as my entire story. And as a 21-year-old kid at the time, that's shocking. That's jarring to see. I mean, you get that back and you're like, am I bad? Like, what have I been doing wrong? Like, I graduated in 4 months. Am I SOL? Am I stuck? And then you realize, no, the reason that someone is putting in this time is because they believe in you, and they believe that you have the potential to make these changes and to make it the story that they see that it can become. And so for me, going through that process, seeing, okay, this quote, I thought it was so good, but it can be better. And here's how. I can chop off this part of it. I can go back and ask a more precise question. I can shut up when someone is answering me and not try and have a back and forth dialogue. All those things, again, you don't learn until you do them. And so at SI, it was a lot of trial and error for me, and a lot of doing things on my own time, because obviously you have obligations and responsibilities with the magazine. But certainly having that under my belt was then supremely helpful for when I was in the working world and had a regular job and was regularly receiving that kind of feedback. It taught me how to engage with it and handle it and build from it in a much more constructive way.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head about, again, learning on the job these important skills. And I think a lot of young, journalists, they want that instant gratification. They want, quick, the path, boom, I'm here already, let's go. But it's a process, and, you have to be patient. And, sometimes, you need that sort of wake up call of the 5-page filled with red notes to sort of say to yourself, like, okay, like, it looks bad, but this is going to help me down the road. And I think once younger writers realize that it's for their own good, it'll serve them well in the real world when they're actually working in a newsroom at a media company.
I couldn't agree more. It is very hard to be told that what you did wasn't quote unquote right. That's not easy to hear. Doesn't matter if you're a journalist, if you're a scientist, if you're a student, any industry that you're in, being told that you didn't accomplish something right then is hard to hear. Yeah. But at the same time, to make it in this industry, especially as the industry is overgoing such massive, massive structural changes, you have to be willing to take that. You have to be willing to accept the criticism and to embrace it. It's gotten to the point now where, there are young journalists who reach out to me, people who are currently working at the Daily Tar Heel, for instance, in college. And they say, hey, I wrote this story. Can you give me some feedback? And really give me feedback. Don't just tell me, oh yeah, it was nice, it was good. Tell me what didn't work. When I hear people asking for that sort of constructive criticism, I think that it gives me a lot of faith that sports journalism and sports writing, even as we undergo so many changes, we're in good shape for the long haul, because people care about the craft and they care about the art, and they want to make sure that they're doing it the right way.
No, that's a great story. And I think the fact that, younger journalists, at your alma mater are reaching out to you, it just shows, that you're doing something right, Brendan, that, they respect you enough. But also, that journalists are willing to help, younger journalists. And I think, like, there's often this sort of fear, like, oh, these are, top people and they have, big time jobs and they're too busy for me. But, like, just take the risk by sending out the email. You never know what's going to happen. I mean, the worst it'll be is no response or a no, but there may be someone that'll be there to help you. And who knows, it could lead, to a real important, relationship that, that mentorship that, you can't beat in this industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I always tell people, if I can help in any way, tell me, because I was that kid. I was sending out emails. Hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of this? What can I be better at? How, what should I try and do next? Like, that was me, and there's this, I saw this thread going around on Twitter, and I posted my own version of it, I think yesterday. Name writers who helped you for no reason other than their own kindness. And there are so many, I mean, too many to name, but so many people have been that person. They've been the person asking that when they do get in a position where they're able to pay it forward. I think the industry overall is very, receptive to passing that forward. So I always tell young journalists, if you want to meet for coffee, let me know when works for you. I can meet you between your classes. If you want to get a bite to eat for lunch, if you want to, if you're 21, you want to grab a beer, whatever I can do to help, if it's a phone call, if it's edits on a story, I'm happy to do whatever I can. Everyone has their own path and their own journey and their own steps to get to where they get to. And anything that we as people who, I appreciate all the kind words you're offering, Lucas. I don't feel like I'm deserving of all of them. As someone, I have a job, I get paid to do this. I have a job. As someone who does have that, it's almost like a responsibility to pay it forward and give it back to people. So I'm always encouraging people to reach out. And I think that same willingness to reach out to people within the industry, it really comes back to help you in your reporting skills, because you learn to not be afraid of making the extra call, or not to be afraid of making the extra text, or not to be afraid of calling somebody back and saying, hey, what did you mean by this? Or can you explain this to me further? When you're able to do that with familiarity within the industry of journalism, then you're able to do it as a journalist much more easily. I found, at least. So, paying it forward to something, anybody who's watching, feel free to email, feel free to DM, feel free to do whatever, any way that I can help, I certainly want to do.
Well, that's, really kind of you, Brendan. And you at the, Charlotte Observer, I mean, you were covering a lot of, different assignments. I mean, Carolina Panthers, Charlotte Hornets, NASCAR. And as a young person, in that, in that setting, did it ever feel intimidating to you, or was it just easy to acclimate just because, you had already covered, a lot of college sports, so you were, ready to get going?
It's interesting you ask. So I don't know. I don't know what the NASCAR fandom is like in Canada, Lucas.
Not big, man. Not big.
I would imagine. Yeah. So I grew up having seen one NASCAR race in my life. I watched some random Daytona 500 with my dad, and that was the extent of my NASCAR knowledge. So I went in not knowing anything other than Jeff Gordon, Dale Earnhardt Jr., Jimmy Johnson. That's what I knew about NASCAR. And I knew big circles. Obviously, there's much more to it. So yep. I actually think that, for a lot of young journalists who, they want to jump straight into working at an ESPN, or they want to go straight to working at Sports Illustrated, and hopefully The Athletic has gotten to the same caliber of place where people want to work here when they get out of school. I think one of the best things that you can do is cover something that you're uncomfortable with, because it really tests your reporting and it tests your writing skills. I mean, for me, I came into NASCAR, this established industry with so many longtime experts and voices, and you have to ask yourself the question, okay, what can I add? Because I was never going to be a rules expert. There are people who sleep with the rule book beside their bedstand like it's the Bible at a hotel. I'm never going to be one of those people. I was never going to be the car junkie who could tell you about the specifics and that sort of thing. I was never going to be the person who could explain to you race strategy. Quickly, things are getting eliminated. What could I still offer? And it really forced me to ask myself, what can I offer as a young journalist? And one thing that we found that was really, really productive was that new perspective. And looking at something that has been done one way for a really long time and saying, this might actually not be the best way. Just because this has been done for 50 years doesn't mean that it can't be enhanced, can't be improved. And so coming in with a new eye, it allowed us to chase story angles that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to. It allowed us to make videos that other people may not have been doing. And I really had to push myself and challenge myself. And so when I turned in a NASCAR story of any, length of time of reporting, of any intensive work on it, I felt more proud of it than I do on a lot of stories, because I knew how much extra I had to work to not only even be able to report the piece, but to try and report it in a way that would distinguish our coverage from other outlets. And so I think challenging yourself is something that a lot of young reporters don't consciously think about first and foremost, because you are worried about making sure that you're on your P's and your Q's and you're doing all the things you're supposed to. But, getting to that point where you can say, all right, I don't know this and I need to be better about it. And here's what I think that I need to know, and then going out and chasing it. That's a really rewarding process for self-discovery, I found.
Yeah, and like two points you made there that I found, really important is, I think, again, young journalists, they want to get to that top beat, and sometimes you got to, work your way up by doing something that, you may not know a lot about, but it teaches you those skills that you will then transfer when you get that opportunity to then, be at, an NFL beat or an NBA or, in your case, now college, two top college basketball programs in the state. But then the second, thing that I found really interesting is, finding that unique angle, because, you look at the Carolina Panthers, let's say, there's reporters that have been there, for years that, have established these relationships with players, executives, etc. But, if you can find that way to, provide your own unique perspective and your unique skills and your unique voice to a very saturated space, you can then gain credibility as a journalist because you're finding something that no one else has found.
And I would add on top of that, more than just gaining credibility as a journalist, and that I think is more a byproduct of the credibility that you gain with the people that you cover.
Of course.
So, for me, covering the Panthers, you're covering an NFL team. You're covering grown men who are working at a profession. It's a job. They're working to feed their families. And so understanding that when you write something, it has very real world impacts on them, about their salary, about their job, about their ability to provide for their loved ones. And so if you can show them that, hey, I understand this aspect of what you do, and you can ask them in an intelligent way, can you tell me more? One of the best conversations that I had when I was covering the Panthers, and this was in an off the record interview, I got to meet with Scott Turner, who was the Panthers quarterback coach. And this was in the process of Cam Newton rehabbing his shoulder. And there was a lot of talk about his mechanics. And so I asked Scott, I said, hey, I understand you want to change his mechanics, but I don't know what that means. Can you explain it to me? What are you trying to do? And he took 45 minutes and we met up, and he had me stand up like one of those test doll dummies. And he's moving my shoulder and he's moving my hips and he's moving my feet and my waist and everything, and showing me this is what I'm trying to get him to do instinctively in the course of 3 seconds with 300-pound men breathing down his neck. And then I'm able to go out and I'm able to relay that information in a more intelligent, but also more unique way, because I've seen it. I've felt it. I now know I understand what he's trying to show. And so we're able to go out and parlay that. And so then other quarterbacks in the locker room say, hey, I saw your video. I read your story. This made a lot of sense. Like, thank you for doing this. I think you cleared up some misconceptions. Those are as productive as anything, having those conversations, because once you earn that trust, that's when the trust starts to carry over to the journalism industry, to fans, to readers. And that's when you're really able to grow as a reporter, is once you have the trust of the people who you're telling their stories. Because if you don't have their trust, then excuse my language, but what the hell are you doing? I mean, that's the point. You're there to tell their stories. And if you can't tell it in a way that is factual, in a way that forwards the conversation, and a way that interestingly and uniquely engages with readers, then you're not doing your job. And so that's how I've always tried to approach it. And so far so good, I guess.
No, for sure. And from your days covering, the Panthers, you then end up where you are right now at the Athletic. And I'm just curious, Brendan, was it a difficult transition for you to go from, print to digital, or was it, was it seamless for you just because, you're in the digital age compared to someone, let's say who's been at print for 20, 30 years, then forcing to then move to digital?
Yeah, it is different, but maybe not as different as some people think. I think probably the best way to describe it is that your priorities become different.
Mm.
So, when I joined the Charlotte Observer, it was very clear to me in the hiring process, and they said, "Listen, we are a website with a print product. We are not a newspaper with a website. We are a website with a print product." And so while we are obviously putting out paper every day and we have print obligations, at the same time, that was not our main focus. But at the same time, if I knew that I had a big story for Sunday's obviously the biggest day. Everyone gets their coffee, they have their Sunday brunch, they read the paper, yada, yada, watch TV. If I knew I had a big Sunday story, I couldn't wait to turn that in until Saturday afternoon. That's something that needed to be in Thursday night or Friday night, so that there was time for the art department to figure out the best visuals, for the layout team to figure out what's the best graphic. There's much more in the process there. Whereas now, if I have a massive story coming out, it's set to come out on, say, Monday, and I have to turn it in, if I turn it in on a Sunday night, it's much easier for my editors and the higher ups to sort of take that and spin it and turn it in 6 hours. So to some extent, the job is different in that way. And that was a bit of an adjustment, as was the regularity with which I write. When I worked at a regular newspaper, you do have that print obligation every day. So I was writing every single day. I would write multiple stories off of an NFL game on Sunday. And then I would write a story off of a press conference on Monday. And then I would write 2 stories on Wednesday and another 2 on Thursday, and then 1 on Friday and 1 on Saturday, and get ready to do it all over again the next week. It's not the case that way anymore, because we don't have that consistent obligation to fill space in print. Now I write 3 or 4 times a week, whenever there's news, whenever there's a story. It gives me more time now. And one of the things that I appreciate the most about my current job in the Athletic, I have time to report stories. If I tell my editor, hey, I need 3 days for this, it's going to take me some time to track these people down. They say, all right, tell me when you're going to give it to me. But having more of that freedom is something that is much more difficult to achieve at a place that does have that legacy print institution. And that's one of the major challenges facing the print industry, especially right now, is trying to square the digital focus with the remaining obligations to satisfy readership with a print product.
No, for sure. And I like the point that you made about, freedom, to write, because I think, and look, I mean, people at newspapers, it's not like they can't produce good content. I mean, they can, but the fact that it's just repetitive day after day after day, there isn't that, ability to do a deep dive on a particular player or a topic or a trend like you would at the Athletic. And, that's why I think the Athletic has been such a success, is not only are you able to, have, really talented writers, who have been in the industry for a while, like Seth Davis and Dana O'Neill in your case, in the college basketball department, but, they also have writers like yourself and many others who, can have the ability to go beyond the game score and the outcome to really produce some eye-opening stories that not many people, would know otherwise.
Right. One of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten in my sports journalism career was look the other way. If everyone is sprinting to the right side of the field or the right side of the court, look to the left. If everyone's looking up at the video board, look down at who's looking. If everyone is looking, if everyone is engaged in one place, everyone is focusing on one person in interviews, go find the person who isn't. Because quite often, that's where you end up getting your best stories. I remember really vividly when North Carolina won the national championship in 2017 in the Final Four. The game comes down to a series of rebounds and free throws, basically. UNC gets an opportunity to make free throws to sort of clinch the game, can't make them, gets a rebound, gets another chance at free throws, can't make them, gets another rebound, gets another chance at free throws. And the guy who kept getting all these rebounds, everyone after the game goes to talk to him. They're like, man, you got all these key rebounds. That's crazy. How did you do that? Tell me. And this dude's got a swarm around him. You're not going to get bad stuff out of that, but you're going to get the same thing everyone else gets. It's a scrum. Instead, I looked around and saw that his roommate, the guy I know who is his roommate on road trips, totally alone, playing at his locker on his phone, having a smoothie. And so I went over, nobody else around, and I said to him, listen, how did he do this? What did he do today that told you that this guy was going to play like this? And he told me this great story about how the guy woke up in the morning playing this Drake album, and he's blasting music on full volume in the shower, and he goes down to breakfast. He has some extra pancakes, and it was, this guy woke up and had the motivation all day and was able to basically build momentum for 12 hours to then exert over the course of 20 minutes. And it was this really cool story with a lot of details that I never would have gotten if I had stayed in that scrum. And so looking outside of convention, that was on a one game example, but that's really what the Athletic asks us to do every single day. They ask us to consistently, whether it is in a game or whether it is in our sports, look to the left when everyone else is looking right. That's where the best stories come from. It's where the best details come from. And it's something that everybody who calls me or emails me, I make sure I tell them, because I think it's one of the most important things in making sure that you are unique and can distinguish your coverage from, like you said, sometimes a lot of saturation in the market.
And speaking of those stories, I mean, you recently wrote a really unique oral history on Vince Carter, and Vince, of course, here in Canada, one of the main reasons why the Toronto Raptors, grew way back in the early 2000s, and of course, Carter played for the Tar Heels. I know that oral histories have become a lot more trendy, especially with not a lot of sports on, and you're trying to find unique ways to create content, but in using that to sort of answer this question, like, what goes into, in your mind, making a really good and compelling oral history?
That's a really good question. Oral histories are hard. Oral histories are not easy to put together. They take a ton of time. That Vince Carter one you're talking about, I started working on it once the college basketball season ended here. So, early, middle of March. And I didn't turn it in until the end of May. And then obviously it ran about a week ago. So it was a 2-month-ish plus process to corral all the interviews, transcribe all the quotes, condense everything, and then to do the hardest part, which is putting the puzzle pieces where they're supposed to be. So I think the things that make for the best oral histories, though, are a couple of things. One, stories. Everyone wants to hear the little anecdotes. They want to hear, okay, what kind of music did Vince Carter listen to in college? What kind of food did he eat? How did he act? How did he behave? If I went to college with this guy, what was that experience like? You want to put the reader in the shoes of being around this person at the time you're writing about. So making sure you get those stories rather than generalizations. A lot of people who I called have a lot of great stories to say, but they also had a lot of the same things that, while very interesting to hear, aren't necessarily going to carry as much of a punch in written form, if that makes sense. Like, people telling me that, not that Vince wasn't a hard worker, but Vince just had it. Vince was a lights on guy. Well, that's great that they can tell me that, but it's much better for them to tell me Vince skipped 2 months of summer workouts, came to one practice, scored 40 points, and never showed up again. Those stories are much more illustrative of some of the generalized speak that you would get. So digging below the surface and getting those stories is important. And the other thing that I think is really important, and this is more in the planning phases, is making sure that you have a diverse body of relationships with the person. I don't know about you, Lucas, but I think if anybody was going to write a story about me, I would rather they speak to my friends and family than speak about me. Because my friends and my family are going to have a lot better things to say about me than I would about myself. It's very hard for people to speak about themselves. Mm-hmm. So making sure that you're getting all around the person, but also that you're getting different relationships. Like, if I had only interviewed Vince's coaches or only interviewed his teammates or only interviewed the training staff, I would have gotten one set of answers. But making sure that I had close teammates, I had random teammates, I had close coaches, I had older coaches, I tried to diversify that pool as much as possible to diversify the answers that I would get as much as possible. And I think that when you can really do that, just a byproduct of it is you get a really nice encapsulation of a person and the different relationships in their lives, and consequently what their life was. And that's the point of the oral history.
Oh yeah, and you definitely hit the nail on the head and checked all those boxes off and producing a really compelling story on Vince. Yeah, like he's certainly mixed emotions still a bit up here in Toronto, given
I'm sure.
but we did win the championship last year, and he came back, so it's a little bit the wound is softened a little bit, but it's just interesting to hear someone and like those perspectives from other people just shape the person overall. It can give a more accurate depiction of them.
Right. I made sure that it was just as important to get Vince's best friend as it was to get his roommate, as it was to get the random walk-on who shared a locker with him, because they all had very different experiences, but experiences that everyone wants to hear about.
I want to end this conversation, Brendan, by talking a little bit about, sort of the future. And obviously right now it's, so uncertain and fluid with the COVID-19 pandemic, and, certainly no word yet about, the college basketball season. And certainly those questions are going to start to swirl once. Yeah, definitely the fingers crossed with, because we love college basketball, and it was unfortunate that we had to miss the conclusion of the season this year. But I'm just curious for you as a reporter. I mean, now you had the chance to work the teams this year, work the locker rooms, build those relationships. I mean, what's it going to be like, coming back from this, particularly if there are just added restrictions for health and safety purposes, i.e., maybe reduced locker room access. I know that that's a topic that's floated around in different sports right now. Obviously, I want to, mention this by saying nothing's been determined yet for college basketball, but I'm just curious your thoughts about that, and what are you looking forward to about the challenge that will certainly be when college basketball resumes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, nothing's been determined, and that's the way, unfortunately, that it seems like it's going to be for a while. This is a virus that we still don't know a lot about. We're still learning every day about it. But that means that we have to keep learning about the best ways to protect ourselves from it. So certainly I don't see a way that we go back to college sports as normal. I just can't see that. I don't see a way that come November 1st, I'm sitting in my courtside seat at Cameron Indoor with 500 students pushing up against me. I just don't see how that's possible anymore. There's going to be differences. How we adapt them and how willing we are to accept them, I think, is going to really make a lot of the difference. But, certainly I think it's possible that access will be reduced. Duke, fortunately, is one of the few schools that still does open locker room access in college basketball after every single game, win or loss. We're allowed to go in the locker room for 10, 15 minutes. That is invaluable time, not just for getting answers for a particular story, but for me to be able to go up to, the 12th guy on the bench and say, happy birthday. What'd you do today? Or to say, I saw your Instagram post about X, Y, and Z. I'm so sorry, your dog. Being able to be a human being in those moments and being able to not just always have it turned on is so valuable. And I feel that is a lot of the time that's going to be cut out. We're going to try and condense everything and make it as necessary as possible. We can do this, but because it's necessary. It's going to be condensed, but it's necessary. There's not going to be any more of that, empty 5 minutes to make a friend or to make a connection or to build a relationship. And that's going to make it much harder for people like myself who are still relatively new to their beats and are learning people's names and faces and things. It's going to make it much harder for us to make those connections. It's going to make it much harder for the athletes to be able to get out some of the stories that they would like to get out and to tell what they have to tell. So, I still think that it is possible for us to have quality sports journalism in the age of COVID. I think that over the past 3 months, we have seen the industry adapt overwhelmingly well to being able to do that. People have been more creative. They have been more willing. They have consistently challenged themselves more than maybe they would in the regular course of a season. But eventually, we do need something. And so how we can learn to continue to employ the same attitude that we have shown the past 3 months once we do have games back again is going to be so important. And if we're not able to do that, then yeah, I think that sports journalism as a whole is going to suffer. But the industry has too many good people and too many good stories and too many good platforms for there not to be an overwhelming supply of incredible sports journalism. People say the industry is in trouble. They see layoffs, they see buyouts, they see furloughs. Obviously, all of that is very disheartening. And having now been through layoffs at 2 separate places, and SI right after I left, make it 3, nobody is exempt. This is not something where you can mark something outside your house and people aren't going to come in and visit you. This is something that the entire industry has to adapt to. As long as we're not naive about that and we're willing to change and we're willing to compromise and we're willing to be creative, that, in my opinion, is our best step forward. And really, as time goes on with this virus, it is increasingly becoming our only step forward, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And I think like the 2 points that you make, look, there'll always be a demand for news. Like there'll always be a demand for sports. I think, there's so many sports fans out there that, just want the content, and there's great people in the industry to provide that content. Now, will it look the same? Not, who knows, right? Like, there's different, trend, and that's about your point about adaptability. You got to adapt. It's like people adapted from newspapers to digital, right? And now, who knows, we could be, moving it in a different medium to disseminate sports, but you have to be willing to adapt. But I think for you, Brendan, I mean, you have a lot of, unique experiences. Like back in undergrad, you cover the same team that you're covering now, UNC, and you got a lot of unique experiences along the way and developed a lot of really important skills that you can rely on, particularly in this time where you got to be creative to produce compelling content.
Absolutely. I mean, being creative is the name of the game. And when I was in school, I had a very, very wise friend at the student newspaper who told me, listen, you're getting your reporting degree from us. You don't need to study reporting as well. And so I studied broadcast journalism, and I learned how to work a camera, and I learned how to do video editing, and I took a radio class, and I also did the more skills that you can add to your resume, the more things you can put in your toolbox, whether that is the ability to file a Freedom of Information Act request, the ability to read a chart, the ability to break down. I mean, the more skills you can add to your toolbox, that's just how much more valuable you're making yourself. And in this age, it's almost becoming less about making yourself valuable and more about making yourself invaluable, making yourself to the point where you do so many things and you can do so many things that any place would be foolish not to have you or to get rid of you. If I have someone who's young and they can write a story, they can read a report, they can understand a press release, they can file a video, they can edit a video, they can do a voiceover, if someone could do all those things, yeah, I want that person, come on. So for young journalists, it's about making sure that you do have the capacity to do all those things. You are willing to do all of those things. And the skills are going to be in demand as long as you're able to do them. You're presenting yourself in the best possible marketplace, the best possible place to engage with a constantly changing market and a constantly changing industry. And if you're not willing to do that, it's very hard to see a future in this industry. Fortunately, there's a lot of more tech savvy and creative and willing people out there than I am. And it's just cool to see how people have changed things up and made them unique and done even better work in spite of all the challenges we're facing right now.
Brendan Marks, he covers Duke and the University of North Carolina basketball for The Athletic. Brendan, loving your energy and enthusiasm. Keep up the great work, man, and thanks so much for joining me today on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.